Welcome back, Armond White. It was just a few months ago that we were talking about your latest book, Make Spielberg Great Again. And in this wonderful series of essays and film criticism going back decades, a recurring theme came up, which was the influence of D.W. Griffith on Steven Spielberg as a director, as a filmmaker, as an auteur. And I confess I had never seen any of Griffith's works. So you graciously agreed to come on and talk about not just his most, probably the film that he's most known for and most notorious for, The Birth of a Nation from 1915, but its follow-up, Intolerance, which you turned me on to because I think in our conversation, I had asked you about Griffith's racism and the charges against him. And you had said, check out Birth of a Nation and then watch Intolerance for sort of the balance to that aspect of his personality, or at least his artistic statement. So I did, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So welcome back, Armond. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And I'm so glad that you embarked on your Griffith research. I'm going to step out and say that it was a great experience for you, as I think it should be a great experience for everyone who sees those films with an open mind.
The open mind part is very interesting. I wanted to start off with the Spielberg connection. When did you find out about Spielberg's influence on, or Griffith's influence on Steven Spielberg? And at that point, were you familiar with Griffith's work, you being a student of film and film criticism, or did finding out about that interest on Spielberg's part prompt you to go look up Griffith?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be educated during a different era than today. And in part of my education was seeing silent films and seeing them without any kind of political censorship. So when I was growing up, Birth of a Nation was available, and Birth of a Nation was taught to students as a significant achievement in the history of motion pictures. And as students, we were encouraged to see it for ourselves, respond to it for ourselves, rather than responding to it the way others tell us to. And we, as young students, film students, we studied Griffith as an artist. And also, as young people growing up in the 60s and 70s, we were able to have an appreciation for racial issues and social issues that reflected our own period. And being part of that particular period, the late 60s, early 70s, we were able to respond to it for ourselves. So I had known Griffith movies and had been entranced by them way before Spielberg ever made a film. So by the time Spielberg comes along in the 70s, but then especially when he made The Color Purple, I never read Spielberg talk about Griffith, but as I watched The Color Purple, I saw it, and I saw it, for instance, the same way in watching Breathless or Shoot the Piano Player. You could see the influence of Hollywood films, of American films from earlier eras, on the imaginative work of the French New Wave directors. This was something that kind of influence, which people often refer to as an homage, was common, especially among American filmmakers of the 1970s. And so when I saw it in Spielberg's work, he didn't have to tell me. I recognized it and I knew it. And I'll say kind of poetically, most importantly, I felt it.
Now, as far as your education in watching silent films, and particularly the Birth of a Nation, and you talk about the cultural attitudes of the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of, racial activism and race consciousness back then. There certainly is still today, but it feels like it's taken on a different tenor. How did you react as, a Black man watching a movie about the birth of the Ku Klux Klan with, say, white actors in blackface and not the most flattering portrayal of, your people? I should say our people, because, I'm part African American as well.
Mhm. Well, in that period, you there's evidence of racism in all of the cultural products of the West, and probably even of the East. But I'm a Westerner,
Mhm.
so I know Western art more than I know Eastern art, and so we're aware of it. We were It was evident, and so it was no surprise. If you'd seen any films featuring Mantan Moreland, Stephen Fetchit, Louise Beavers, seeing black stereotypes, and finally seeing black stereotypes in a film as early as Birth of a Nation was not a shock to me or anyone of my generation. We knew that this is what occurred in Hollywood products that were made throughout the history of Hollywood. So it wasn't a shock, and it wasn't a special offense. It was like, there it is again. But the interesting thing about Birth of a Nation is that its narrative places those stereotypes in a broader and deeper context, so that it's not just an offensive. The black characterizations of Birth of a Nation were not just an offensive stereotype. They're not simply offensive stereotypes. There was a context for them, and you understood it. I think, and everyone can understand how it fits into the story of the Confederacy versus the North. It's not it's not particularly shocking or unusual or offensive. It is, I think, to be expected. If you've read Mark Twain, if you've read Pudd'nhead Wilson, which I would recommend to anybody before Huckleberry Finn, in fact, you expect it. If you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, as young students were made to do, you expected it. You expected to see it there. So it's not particularly shocking. It's to be understood as part of American culture. And American culture is to be recognized, accepted, understood in the correct context, not to be censored.
And that's, that is something that, when we get to talk about intolerance,
Mm.
which I agree it's not exactly an antidote to Birth of a Nation, because I think there's a key element that would be missing for that to be the case, and we'll get to that. But
Mm.
I didn't know about intolerance until you told me about it. I knew about Birth of a Nation, but all I knew about it was that was the evil, racist Klan movie. But people would kind of grudgingly say, yeah, but it was also an influential Hollywood film, but you should probably also, stay away from it because there's, the story is garbage. Um, so I guess it's what I'm searching for here is, at what point do you think did you start to recognize that it was not cool to be looking into these earlier works of Griffith?
Uh, for me, it was never not cool. It's what a film student does. It's what a student of any art form has to do. You have to know your history. You have to know what came before, and you also have to know what's good. And because how can you ever say how can you ever judge a contemporary film unless you have something to judge it by? And how can you ever say a movie is any good unless you've seen a good movie as an example? Birth of a Nation is an example. Uh, it never bothered me, and I understood that really the uh, the the black stereotypes in Birth of a Nation are the weak parts of it. Everything else in it is undeniably great and insightful into human nature, which is why Griffith deserves to be respected as an artist. Not deserves to be not calling him a perfect human being, not calling him a perfect artist either. But his feeling for human experience is is seen throughout the Birth of a Nation. Also, the story of the beginnings of the Ku Klux Klan is recognized as a white Confederate myth, and it's a version of that story of the origins of the Klan. However, as we know now, it's a different version than what has been taught to us by, or taught or not taught to us by contemporary liberal political activists who deny the Klan's birth in the Democratic Party. They deny that connection altogether, whereas they like to demean and dismiss Griffith, which is a kind of dishonesty that I think cancels their criticism of Birth of a Nation, because they're not responding to the Birth of a Nation as honestly, and they're not responding to the birth of the Klan as honestly as Griffith did, or rather as forthrightly as Griffith did.
Yeah, it's tricky because, watching the film, first of all, I was taken aback by it's Birth of a Nation is 3 hours long, as is Intolerance, and it's told in two distinct acts. Uh, Act one ends with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but leading up to that, aside from some white actors in blackface, there was not the overt racism, the really problematic stuff that I'd expected when I turned on the movie. I thought it was just going to be, outrageous from the get-go, to the point where I took a little bit of a break between the acts, and I went and I had lunch or something. I came back to it. And then when Act two started, that's when that's reconstruction. That's the, as you say, the Klan, the origin of the Klan narrative having to rise up to stop the spread of the black scourge across the South now that, they're free. That was really kind of disturbing to me. But by the time Birth of the Nation, by the climax, where the Klan is charging in to save the family in distress that's being besieged in a small cabin, I compartmentalized my feelings about what was going on and was so swept up in the visual drama of what was happening. It's undeniably a thrill to watch those charging horses coming into the rescue. The siege on the cabin, I immediately thought of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, at the end of the house when the zombies are coming in. I know that's probably horribly offensive to someone watching that, but it was just as intense a scene. And I forgot about the potential character issues. I'm saying the issues of character with the characters. I was just caught up in, oh my God, these people are about to be horribly murdered.
That's a very interesting response, and I relate to that. There are I want to say that there are key two aspects to Griffith's artistry. One is his understanding of human nature, and the other is his innovation of the cinematic art form. And this is part of the complex and fascinating experience of watching Birth of a Nation, because you're dealing with both aspects of his artistry. You're watching him make fully human characters on one hand, but you're also watching him manipulate the art form in a powerful and undeniable way, in a visceral and kinetic way. And so you have to deal with both aspects of his artistry. And but this has never changed. This has always been, I would say, the excitement, the adventure of motion pictures. We have to deal with the aesthetic and kinetic experience of watching movies, and we also have to think about, contemplate, and criticize how human experience is depicted. So it's nothing so simple as saying, oh, it's racist. It's never that simple, and it's not that simple in Birth of a Nation either. In point of fact, the black characters in Birth of a Nation have pretty much very little to do with the narrative, and so it's just something that you have to deal with, and that's the same for Birth of a Nation, I would say, as it is for The Social Network, where the one black character that appears in The Social Network is a black racial stereotype. If you're going to be easily offended by things like that, then one should be as offended by The Social Network as one is by The Birth of a Nation.
Well, it's also interesting that as unflattering a portrayal as black characters are in Birth of a Nation, they're not overtly depicted as the villain, or at least the driving villainous force. That's reserved for the if I have the connection right, Stoneman, the rich kind of political businessman who manipulates the situation in the South he sends a mulatto representative down to the South to win over the blacks and sort of uprising against Southern whites to gain political power. So they are easily manipulated as a people, which, that's that's not flattering at all. But in terms of the villainous character, it does not paint that great a portrait of, white men as you might think from, as much as the Klan is sort of presented as heroes of this story, the white man is also, there's a negative light cast on him as well.
There is that. There's also I think, a very rich understanding of the political differences between the North and South. A very moving, I think, depiction of the national rift that occurs with the civil rights. With the Civil War, the rift between the two families. I think this is very strongly illustrated in Birth of a Nation, and is part of its excellence as storytelling, and part of its power as a film. The only parts of the movie that, as you say, are disturbing would be the reconstruction scenes in the Congress, where the depictions of the black politicians are cartoonish, and really, I think for any intelligent viewer, they would have to be cartoonish, especially for an intelligent viewer today, and who grew up in the sound era, who grew up way past the silent movie era. They are cartoonish, and the cartoonishness makes the offense bearable, because you don't quite believe it. It's kind of ridiculous, and you know that Griffith is being ridiculous here, and that's almost dismissible, because then the other parts of his artistry take over. The parts that are sympathetic to the humanity of the white characters, and the parts that are supremely aesthetic in terms of how to create tension, how to create excitement, how to create emotional affinity with the major character.
Well, and that's, I think, ultimately what makes Birth of a Nation a historically great tragedy is the little Colonel, Colonel Cameron, who is he's fighting for the Confederacy. In the first half of the film, Act 1, he goes to war. There's some spectacular battle scenes. He is captured at the very last, leading a charge across the battlefield. I believe he's shot, horribly wounded, but he stuffs the Confederate flag down the barrel of a cannon on the firing line as his last act of heroism. If you take away the context of, who/what he was fighting for, that's a great cinematic moment.
Sure.
But later on, as after he's been captured, he's set to be executed. His mother goes to make an appeal to President Lincoln, new president, newly elected, I think, President Lincoln, to grant his son clemency, and Lincoln refuses initially, but then he kind of gives in and lets the guy live. When Cameron returns to the South shortly thereafter, Lincoln's assassinated, and the end of Act 1 is the Cameron family receiving the news. I believe it's on a newspaper that Lincoln has been shot, and I don't remember the title card specifically, but he says something about, like, what are we going to do now that our friend is gone, or something like that. It's an emotional cliffhanger, because that's not the way that I expected an act break to be, where you've got the Confederate soldier who was out there killing people, and his people were dying on the battlefield for an ideal, and the Northern Union president is assassinated, and he's not jumping for joy. He's crestfallen because he feels like he's lost someone who did him a solid.
Right. Do you remember what the title, how the Lincoln title card describes Abraham Lincoln? Do you recall that?
I don't recall it. No.
He's described as the Great Heart.
Yes. Yes.
And the great. That right there is an interesting indication of how Griffith, who himself did not experience the Civil War, but whose sense of the Civil War came from whatever he could have read, or from whatever his Confederate family members could have told him, coming from cultural and family myth. He yet has an attitude about Abraham Lincoln from the North, that is sophisticated and modern, and quite a contrast, in fact, to the way Spielberg depicts Lincoln in Lincoln. Quite a where in point of fact, all the years, almost a century later in Lincoln, Spielberg doesn't quite cop to the fact that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican president and a Republican fighting the, in a sense, going against the racism of the Democratic South. So, there's a little less sophistication in that 2010 film than there is in that 1915 film.
Yeah. Well, it's also something that you get across, or Griffith got across, in title cards and the physicality of the actor. You could see a lot of the weight in that performance, even though it's only a couple of minutes, the scene between him and the mother, there's some real kind of conflict and sympathy there, which was nice to see. I want to talk about the assassination because I have not watched a lot of silent film. I've watched older movies, but I wasn't prepared for the degree of violence in that moment. And particularly when we get to Intolerance, there's some absolutely shocking visuals in there. But when John Wilkes Booth assassinates Lincoln, there's some great theater intrigue of the guard going away from the door and, Booth sneaking into the booth, as it were. But there's the orchestral accompaniment to the visuals that's then punctuated by the pop of the gunshot. That just, it was literally a breathtaking moment. Now, I guess I wasn't prepared for that kind of violence because I just guessed things were different back then, but I guess not.
Well, that's one of the surprises and pleasures of discovering silent movies. That first of all, that when they're shown at their proper speed, they're not these herky-jerky, fast-paced photographic cartoons. That they are, in fact, photographic dramas that call for a serious emotional response, and that achieves those emotional responses in completely justifiable and ingenious ways. Silent movies are not an art form to feel superior to. It's why we have movies today, because artists like Griffith innovated it, and innovated cinematic storytelling in ways that last.
Well, certainly in terms of the battlefield portions of that film, and then later on in Intolerance, I honestly could not understand what I was looking at, because I'm used to seeing these giant CGI battles, going back to Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and all that stuff. You kind of understand, oh, this was done in a computer. That's not to say it's easy, but you're not getting a cast of thousands with these giant elaborate sets. Watching The Birth of a Nation and these really impressive battlefield scenes, even the theater scene with the assassination, I don't know if they constructed all of these. I don't know how they cast and found all the equipment and the artillery to pull this stuff off, but you really feel like you are on the ground in the middle of an actual historical battle watching these. Even if there's no sound, you can't hear the cannons going off. You just hear the instrumentals, but right. You can almost hear things exploding in your mind while you're watching it. It's completely transportive. And one of the shames, I think, by Griffith not really getting his due today is that people aren't, well, nobody's going to the movies anymore right now, but people aren't experiencing his work on the big screen, I think, in the way that they should be. Not only the visual spectacle, but just to appreciate what someone could have done in the movies 100 years ago, especially when a lot of modern audiences, no offense to modern audiences, okay, some offense to modern audiences, they think movies didn't exist before 1982.
Right. One of the, I say again, one of the pleasures of discovering silent movies, and this one in particular, is that you have to realize the enormous imagination that it took to pull all of that together, and also appreciate that that what Griffith is also doing is not just simply working out of his not being creative, but he's also he's responding to history in a very I'm going to say sophisticated way again. Those battle scenes are modeled after Civil War photographs by the Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. Um, that's a way of connecting audiences in 1915 to their own history, to their own forms of media, and it's a very sophisticated way of telling a story in cinematic terms. It's not a film that one needs to feel superior to or condescend to. I think it still works in very sophisticated ways. Um, there's the battle scenes are extraordinary as you described them, and also one of the most famous images in the movie is the sequence called War's Peace, and which is an image of the cost of war, an image of death. That is one of the great images of death in Western art, and Griffith deserves credit for that, frankly. And maybe people would be likely to appreciate it if contemporary attitudes towards war and the military had not changed to the extent that they have, so that people don't understand or appreciate or recognize what sacrifice means, or the pain of war tragedy. But it's all there in that sequence, and particularly in that War's Peace shot that Griffith innovates. Uh, that's remarkable.
Yeah, 1 second. Can you lower your camera a bit? I'm getting your mouth's getting cut off a little bit. There you go. That's better. Yeah, cool. So yeah, and not just the attitudes about war, but as we've discussed, I mean, I think it'd be a very hard and probably very brief conversation if you're suggesting bringing this, displaying this movie in a kind of prominence in the social climate we're in.
Mm-hmm.
Although that's not to say that if audiences were willing to give Birth of a Nation a chance specifically, that they wouldn't come out of it with possibly a greater understanding for it as a piece of art, with some attitudes that, if they can slap a sticker on Gone with the Wind saying, this this no longer reflects the contemporary attitudes, I think they could do the same thing with Birth of a Nation. Although that would add to, I think, it seems about 10 minutes of opening title cards, complete with a censorship disclaimer opening the movie, which I thought was very funny, especially especially in 2021. Yeah, so
well, that all comes down to people are not being taught how to think; they're being told what to think. They're not being taught to appreciate art and to respond to it in an honest manner, and that's the problem. There should be no problem. There really should be no problem with understanding why Birth of a Nation was considered a great work of art. When you see sequences like the homecoming of the little colonel, that's purely human, and if you can't respond to that, you've got the problem. It's not Griffith's problem. And young people and contemporary audiences need to be educated to understand how art works, actually understand how they are supposed to relate to characters and works of art, not approve them, but relate to them and find your own humanity in their example, even when they do things that are wrong. That's why the lecherous mulatto, who's after Lillian Gish, is a character whose feelings can be understood rather than just the stereotypes that's outrageous and offensive.
Yeah,
he is a character after all.
And Lillian Gish and also Griffith, they both had, I think we kind of talked about this last time, they had honors sort of stripped from very prominent public places in recent years, in the last 20 years. Did that stem largely from this film, or were there other issues that I haven't heard about? Do you know?
My understanding is as to what happened with the Lillian Gish or the Gish Sisters Theater and Memorial at Bowling Green University. It's simply an example of contemporary cancel culture and people looking for excuses to show their superiority to the past um, and showing their superiority to others. I think it's as simple as that. I don't think, I don't think that kind of censorship would come from someone who actually saw Birth of a Nation and got it. It just comes from silly activism.
Yeah, and I understand that to a certain extent because a 3 hour silent film is a tough is a tough sell, whereas you could simply show a couple of frames of the Klansmen on horseback or the blacks in Congress and say you really want to endorse this or watch this. The answer for a lot of people I think would be no, and that's it really is to their detriment.
Yeah, and you could do that with anything if you take shots, scenes out of context. Uh, for example, the that thrilling ride to the rescue at the end, the climax of the film, the ride to the rescue by the Klan. That's one thing, but anybody who said that they don't feel the excitement there, I think would be lying. But I say that they should also look at that sequence and note some of the details in it. There's a detail of a white girl child who's caught in the cabin where the that's under siege by the blacks, and the little girl's reaction. The adults are scared. There's even a white man who takes out a pistol as if to kill one of the women rather than have her subjected to what would happen once the blacks get in.
That's what I thought was going on in that in that moment, but I wasn't quite sure.
And think about that and think about the psychology of behind that, because Griffith is quite aware of human psychology as well. And another example is that's what one of the adults is doing in the scene, but the scene also contains a girl child, who is not frightened but is excited at what's going on, and her excitement is, I say, is another illustration of Griffith's understanding of the complexity of complex human psychology. I can't think of another example where in a scene of imminent danger, we see a person, in this case a child, who is excited by it, who isn't afraid at all, but whose emotions are so keyed up that they are giddy. That's rich stuff, and the only filmmaker I can think of who is remotely capable of creating such complexity would be Spielberg.
Well, I would have to say I can think of another example of a character like that, and a female character in a D.W. Griffith film, which is Mountain Girl in Intolerance, which we'll get to in a second, because during almost her entire storyline, she is geared up to fight. She is what you would term a strong female character 100 years before that was even a thing on anybody's minds, really, in terms of the cinema. And it comes from the the unlikeliest of places. The one thing that I thought was really interesting, and maybe you've got some insight on this, and it is the issue of the blackface. There are intermingled characters or actors in the film. Some are actually, black performers, and some are white performers in blackface. But I couldn't quite figure out the reason why some were in blackface and some were just black, actors, or I guess performers. I don't know how much they were acting. That sounds really terrible. But do you know what the distinction was? Like, why do they have that mixture?
I don't know. But I'm glad you returned to or you brought up that point. The era we're living in has forgotten what the tradition of blackface means in American culture, in Western culture. It was part of it, and we still haven't lost it either, by the way. Uh, so there it exists. There it is in Birth of a Nation. You have white actors in blackface, and you also have black actors portraying blacks. He mixes the two together. I guess you could say that shows a kind of development of the blackface of the minstrel tradition. Uh, you see right there the minstrel tradition developing into a complex style of theatrical style that is practiced by both blacks and whites, which is of course the truth of minstrelsy and blackface. And it's there for us to think about it and come to terms with it, but coming to terms with it as a cultural development, not necessarily to simply dismissing it. That would be closing our minds to the development itself.
Right, because I think one thing I was expecting going in is that the blackface, because I knew that was a part of this film, I expected it to be the stereotypical cartoonish, almost like what we see from the authentic black actors in that Congress scene. I expected all portrayals of blacks to be that in this movie. But even the actors, the white actors in blackface, they're not okay. A couple of them are doing but they're playing the wacky characters. I'm thinking of the maid and the other guy who lives in the Cameron house. They kind of try and affect this rescue at the end, and they're seen as very comical characters. But I feel like you could have had that in any movie of any race. They're just clowns. But
Sure.
the black actors or the white actors in blackface, a lot of them, they were just playing regular characters. They didn't have a whole lot to do because this is a white heroes movie, but they weren't all offensive on their faces.
Sure, sure. And then probably the major, most villainous character, black character in Birth of a Nation would be Gus, uh, and clearly a white actor in blackface. But this again is part of the minstrel tradition that is at the core of American entertainment. Um, I see no point in objecting to it, particularly in Birth of a Nation. It's the way entertainment was. It's the way entertainment was made in America.
And it's unfortunate that there is that kind of stain on that, because the moment where Gus pursues Flora Cameron, who's played by Mae Marsh, the youngest, I think she's youngest Cameron daughter. She's kind of frolicking out in the field. Gus, this black guy, is also out in the field. He sees her, he's enamored with her. He sort of attacks her and then chases her. She tragic comically throws herself off of a cliff. But watching that actor's performance, the guy who played Gus, it's such a weird, lecherous performance that I think would have worked even if he hadn't been wearing blackface. Again, I don't see it so much as a black stereotype, although that probably was the intent. But I could see him as just almost like something out of I Spit on Your Grave or something. It just seemed like this backwoods creature.
Well, it's very much like there's a very similar scene in the silent version of Last of the Mohicans, in fact. So in a sense, it's not so. Although race is an element there, uh, the drama uh, in that scene is not so much about race as it is about sex and female virginity and the fear, and that's the fear of sexual violence. That's really where the power of that sequence comes from. Actually, I would say, and also I'll tell you, when watching that as a film student in the 1970s, when she jumps off the cliff, we laughed. I granted, maybe audiences did not laugh in 1915, but I can tell you that in 1970, we laughed, and because it's bye bye,
Yeah. um, I
I'm not just being funny about it, because I think in some ways there's a type of cultural and moral sophistication that modern audiences should have that protects them from certain kinds of offense, and we shouldn't lose that either. We shouldn't be so overly sensitive or falsely sensitive that we're offended by everything.
I agree. And it's, watching that moment in particular, I can acknowledge that funny in the execution, not funny in terms of the subject matter, but
Mm.
also thrilling because, again, it didn't look like they filmed that on a set. It it
Mhm.
looked like they were actually out. They'd found a field with a sort of mountainous, or some kind of a hillscape that they could film that scene on, where he is pursuing her out onto the ledge of this rock. So I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. Of course, you've got the little colonel running to try and rescue her, but he doesn't get there in time. So yeah, this movie is nothing if not a bundle of emotions wrapped up in the appreciation of art. Yeah, there's not one dimension by which you can appreciate, or I don't think you can appreciate just with one dimension unless you're completely closed off to the experience, in which case, why even bother? Um, but I think I want to move on now to Intolerance, which, as I recall, you had deemed this is it right, the best movie of all time? Is that still your opinion?
No, the greatest movie ever made.
Greatest. Okay, so what's the distinction there?
No, I just that's a clarification there. It's not just the best; it's the greatest film ever made.
Okay.
The word great meaning it has the largest ambition of any film I know of, and achieves it. And nothing I have not seen anything better than this, sound or silent.
Now, which brings up the Citizen Kane question. How do you feel about that one?
Um, Citizen Kane is Citizen Kane. It's a great movie. I prefer Ambersons among the Wells films. Certainly, I think Ambersons is a greater film than Citizen Kane, but Intolerance is better than both.
Okay, and that fair enough. I appreciated watching Birth of a Nation, but then watching Intolerance, I was not ready for it. Birth of a Nation is a great primer for what Griffith does in Intolerance. He takes that up to an entirely different level. I can't believe that these films came out within a year of each other, because especially for the day, you'd expect something like Intolerance to take 5 years to pull off. Uh, it reminded me a lot of the Wachowski movie, Cloud Atlas from
Right,
2012,
right.
where you've got a bunch of different storylines in different time periods thematically looping back together. And in this case, you've got the story of Jesus. You've got a contemporary, I guess, 1900s love story. You've got the fall of Babylon, and like 1500s, what was it, Protestant Huguenot war. Uh, and it all works. It doesn't sound like it should work, but it is pretty perfect. Now, I don't know if I can call this the greatest film of all time in my own estimation, but I'm willing to definitely hear that case, because granted, I did just see it, an hour ago, so it's still percolating in my head. But I can't describe all of the emotions I felt watching this movie. One of which was I was very fortunate to have seen it before I died, because I didn't know it existed, a couple months ago. But the other is I really want to share this with people. I'm happy to know that it's streaming right now on Amazon Prime. I actually bought a 2 disc DVD of Birth of a Nation and Intolerance, so they're all in one package. But how did you come to discover Intolerance? Was this also part of your film school education, and did you watch it sort of back to back with Birth of a Nation, or did you discover it later?
I'm well. I have to try to remember when I first saw Intolerance. I could have seen it on television. When I was growing up, you could see movies on TV, especially on the Late Show, and especially silent films. Uh, Stay up until 11 or midnight and see movies on television. Now you stay up until 11 at midnight and you see old TV series. I grew up when you could watch old movies, and Griffith films were among them. In fact, I know that I first saw Orphans of the Storm on the Late Show, what used to be called the Late Show, movies that were broadcast at 11 p.m. or 12 a.m. And I frankly don't quite remember where I first saw Intolerance, but I know I saw it in film school. I know I saw it as an undergrad, and in those circumstances, so it's kind of projected on 16 millimeter film, so it's larger than a TV screen, which helps. And and it's an undeniably amazing experience. because Griffith's genius uh, interweaves those four stories without any confusion, without any moment of confusion of where you are at any one point. And I think a musical term is appropriate. The contrapuntal rhythms of those four different stories play so perfectly, and at the same time, as the drama in each story builds, the drama of the entire film itself builds and builds, and it becomes very powerful, and then it shifts into mad genius supremacy, or superlativeness, with the way it concludes. It concludes with a kind of second coming, in a sense, and a celebration of goodness. That is it's such a magnificent vision that it's not laughable. It's ecstatic. Um,
And it also
I think it's
seems.
the greatest film. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say that that end sequence, it does seem like a thematic evolution of the way Birth of a Nation concludes, because that also has this almost like a revelation type of capper to it. We see that in Intolerance, but Intolerance is a very much a moral movie. It sets out, I think it says so in the title cards. You know, these are four stories about the dangers of intolerance, and intolerance is always referred to as an evil, as a force of murder and chaos that people are struggling against and fighting for the good. I think it's. I saw shades of The Godfather
Mm-hmm.
in the climax, in that you've got all of these story elements percolating to a head, and they're very evenly paced with the title cards, with the coming in and out of the different stories. There's these little breaks with the Hand of Fate, which is Lillian Gish in this weird chamber, with I guess the three fates or somebody kind of sitting in robes in the background, and she's rocking an empty cradle
Mm-hmm.
to sort of help punctuate the jumps through time. But by the end of this, we are in full on modern filmmaking, editing, storytelling techniques where they do away with a lot of the title cards. The sequences get compressed together. So you're jumping between a car outrunning a speeding train, the siege of Babylon, Jesus, on his way to being crucified. It's just completely bananas. And it reminded me of the end of The Godfather, and I guess all the other Godfather movies, because Coppola kept repeating himself, where the last 5 minutes you have to have multiple murders going on in different locations.
Mm-hmm.
But it's absolutely amazing to me, especially going back to this idea of the battle scenes in Birth of a Nation. I really don't know how he pulled off constructing these huge kingdoms, those giant iron doors that armies would sweep through, the car running up to the train, swerving onto the train track, and you see an actual oncoming train. That, I don't think those were miniatures. I think I saw people in all of those vehicles. I
Right.
I honestly, I was watching movie magic unfold.
It's an astonishing achievement. I use superlatives. That's why I use superlatives when I talk about it, because the ambition, the imagination, and then the ability to pull it off, and not just the big spectacular moments, but also human moments. Intimate moments, I should say. All the moments are human throughout the film, but the intimate moments are also strong, and especially in the modern story, but throughout all of it, though, it's still an astonishing movie. It's over 100 years old, and every more people should know it in order to, well, in one sense, to know what's possible in the cinematic medium. Uh, look how long it took the Wachowskis to discover it, because I think they're ripping it off in Cloud Atlas, but and not even to a fraction of the effect either. But that kind of sophistication needs to be more widely known and better appreciated than it has been.
I agree. There was this, I believe it was the siege of Babylon, where Cyrus was, his armies were storming the castle of Belteshazzar, while on the inside of that kingdom they were all partying and celebrating and getting drunk, too drunk to defend themselves once they were overrun, which is very tragicomic. But there are these giant towers on wheels that are being maneuvered over to the castle gates, with people, with arrowsmiths and, catapults and rocks and fire and flaming oil. Again, I can understand that in the context of today, where you can computer generate a lot of that and maybe have some actors on a green screen doing parts of it and compositing them in. But when I'm watching one of those giant towers fall with people inside onto a crowd of other people, while there's fire and flames and everything going on, I don't get it. Like, how is that? How did nobody die while making this? Maybe people did die and I just don't know. But the sheer, I think you said it, the ambition of pulling that off, 100 years ago, it's something that I think more people should just be that inspired, that ambitious in movies today. Without, they didn't have computers back then.
Well, you said about, you mentioned being overwhelmed or impressed by the movie magic. Uh, I don't use the term movie magic,
Okay.
I think I understand exactly what you mean, and so I'll put it this way: uh, go back to why movies are fascinating, and it's because they are photographs of reality. They are photographs of nature, photographs of human experience, and it captures human experience, human movement. Uh, it captures the face, and it turns the face, it turns motion, it turns experience into something that we are forced to behold and contemplate, and to be impressed and moved by. And also, in part, uh, if one is inclined to appreciate the spiritual essence of living. And that's what I say, that's what every great movie does. I think Griffith does it throughout Intolerance. I think that's one of the points of Intolerance, whether it's an intimate scene or a widescreen spectacle image of a battle. Uh, the spirituality of life, of living, is captured. I think he understood it. I think understanding it was also part of his experience as a human being at the beginning of the 20th century, and that knowledge is something that we may have lost in contemporary film culture, which is less less inclined to think in spiritual terms. And it's in those spiritual terms that I think intolerance can be seen as a way of rectifying what was misunderstood about Griffith in Birth of a Nation. Um, he's beyond simple racism. He's really interested in the cosmic, in the existential, uh, in the spiritual. And it is, I think it is a great achievement to blend all those ideas together with those four different points in history that he shows in the four stories of Birth of a Nation. It is an indication that this is a man who he not only thought big, he had big thoughts. And I'm not sure that there are many contemporary filmmakers who are capable of such. I think many filmmakers think small. They think primarily politically, which is a way of shrinking their own human essence, their own spiritual potential. Spielberg is great; he doesn't, and I think he got that. I think he got that from Griffith. Uh, I should also say that when I said that I felt it in The Color Purple, I should be more specific about that. It was in The Color Purple, the separation scene between the two sisters, it simply is the separation scene from Orphans of the Storm. And I think Spielberg understood how powerful that is in Orphans of the Storm. You should. I recommend you see that one on
I
your Griffith list. By the way, Ian. Uh, and Spielberg got the right idea. He got the right essence from Griffith.
Well, you better be careful, because I'm gonna rope you into talking about Orphans of the Storm and The Color Purple together as companion pieces. Um,
That's a conversation to have for sure.
but no, there is something that is quite amazing, and I think you mentioned the disconnect here in modern filmmaking is the spectacle of Griffith, but also the heart and the brains and the spirituality. I'm going back to Mountain Girl, who is the I think this is the character I'm getting right. She is the one in the Babylon sequence who was in love with the king, right?
Right.
But he was married to sort of this vapid Ishtar worshiping queen, and he was distracted to the point of being his undoing. But she was so in love with him, partially because he did her two solids, sparing her life on two occasions, one in the kind of metaphorical sense by not allowing her to be sold on a marriage market, and the other in a quite literal sense where she was about to be put to death and he said, no, back off, she's cool. Later on in the film, when a plot is hatched that she learns of to depose the king from within, his high priest was scheming to team up with Osiris, or not Osiris, with Cyrus to raid the castle and take down Babylon. She goes on a reconnaissance mission. She ends up being a kick-ass warrior in that final skirmish, even though Babylon is doomed to fall. She was a character that I wish we could see more of in contemporary film. She's complex. She is, she's got a tremendous amount of spirit to her. It's not just that she's, killing people or kicking ass and taking names. She doesn't have any real dialogue because, again, it's a silent film, but you get so much out of the performance and the ideas around the type of story that Griffith is telling with the early scenes, with the later scenes, that she's a more well-rounded character than I think I've seen in movies in the last, 5 years at least.
Oh, yes. She's remarkable in that sense. Also, what's very moving about the Mountain Girl story is her devotion.
Yeah.
And her faith, really. And I think that's a common theme throughout the four stories of Intolerance. And that faith, if I know that's a phrase that frightens some people, but it's still a valid concept for many human beings. And also, I think Griffith understands faith as also a form of love. One of the subtitles for the film is Love's Struggle Through the Ages. But every one of the four stories is in some ways an illustration of love / faith, and how it is demonstrated, how it's lived, and how it is threatened, and eventually how it overcomes prejudices and lack of faith and inhumanity and loneliness. And these are beautiful things that I think contemporary filmmakers and audiences are embarrassed to admit. But it's the essence of culture. It's the essence of storytelling. And what more? I would say, what more can you ask? But I also feel that when you see something like Intolerance, for me, it's like, what more can you get from a movie? You can't get anything more than that.
Well, it's something I just thought about while you were talking there, about the portrayals of faith in the film. We do get a lot of moments of praying, characters praying in different time periods, one praying to God, one praying to Ishtar. I'd forgotten, because it sort of takes a back seat to two of the main stories, is the Jesus portion. We see him at different points in his life, but here you have a scene of a man essentially being condemned to death. He is a manifestation of the God that one of the people in the other storylines in the other time periods is praying to. I don't quite know exactly what that means, but it's something I want to go back and think on. I don't know if he was digging down that deep into the psychology of it, but it's a fascinating thing to think about.
Sure. I think sometimes artists go on instinct and intuition and feeling. I think that's part of what makes art universal. There's a concept that we've lost in modern culture that art should be universal, but that's what makes art universal, and it's also what makes movies as wild as Intolerance may seem on paper. It's what makes them work on the screen. Uh, just because it works intuitively, it works through sheer imagination and emotion. But all of that, of course, it's not just happenstance. It's worked on and constructed, and it's achieved.
One of the other achievements, I think, was the way that Griffith, again, I don't know how much of this was deliberate versus who was available, but there are a lot of cast members between Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. And specifically, Mae Marsh, who plays the dear one in Intolerance, was also the young Cameron daughter from Birth of a Nation who jumped off the cliff.
Right.
She jumped off the cliff being pursued by by Gus, who is played in Intolerance. He plays a character called, I believe he's the Musketeer. He's sort of the local crime boss in the contemporary story.
Mm-hmm.
And in both films, these two actors play characters who end up getting into physical, almost like sexual assaulting conflict with each other. At the point where they were fighting in Intolerance, even though I think she was struggling with her baby, maybe, or that might have been a different scene, but I was waiting for her to jump out of a window just to complete the illusion. Allusion, not illusion.
That sequence, I think, is kind of terrifying.
Yes.
Where the essence of motherhood, mother love, is threatened. It's quite powerful, and it's the one moment in the film that is. This would sound strange to say about Intolerance, a film that's such a magnificent experiment, but it's the one moment in the film where Griffith gets almost abstract, I would say, because that's where the Mae Marsh character is at a moment of great despair, and she walks towards the camera and she goes out of focus. And that's remarkable to me because, of course, Griffith was careful about everything that he put into his movies. She doesn't go out of focus because he and Billy Bitzer don't know how to control their camera, but she goes out of focus because the emotion is overwhelming, and it's another remarkable effect in the film. But it's what they call in old time filmmakers they call it an in-camera effect. It's not CGI, but again it's the realism of human emotion, human experience of life.
Well, and it's also I made that joke about her jumping out the window. That was just something that occurred to me. I was also caught up in the drama of, my God, this is going horribly south. What I loved was that scene was a catalyst for what we talked about earlier, the train and the car scene. I mean, a lot of stuff happens between those two moments, but there's some wonderful intrigue in that apartment with the Musketeer's jilted wife kind of sneaking around Mae Marsh's character's husband, coming in and trying to stop this weird struggle. There's gunplay, there's death, there's horrible, death, there's cops, all kind of snowballing from a scene that you think is just going to be, this is going to sound terrible, a simple attack that we've seen 100 times before. There's nothing ordinary about it, and there's several extraordinary things about the consequences of that, not the least of which is the resolution of the film, where one character has been condemned to death and is seconds away from execution. Given the way that the other three storylines go, and I guess I'll get a little spoilery here, they don't end well. They all end in death, tragedy, and destruction. The hanging sequence is the one where there is a glimmer of hope at the end. But I think because that, I believe that's the last bit of resolution we see, we're kind of tricked into thinking that this is going to have a sad ending too, and this movie is just going to be a major bummer.
Well, it isn't. It isn't.
No.
And I guess, you give credit to one of the artists who most influenced Griffith, that he admitted in being influenced by, which would be Dickens
Mm.
and Charles Dickens, and also it's excellent showmanship, and certainly at the development of motion pictures, you don't want to send audiences out glum. It's good showmanship to end hopefully, and there's so much tragedy and complexity that's already been played out for you, that you need that kind of catharsis, frankly.
Yeah.
You need that kind of resolution. And let me say in modern terms, because I'm dealing with movies and music all the time. I'm in a sense reminded of Elvis Costello's album Armed Forces. Do you know that album, by the way?
No, I don't.
You should. You should. It's a great thing, but it's a very dark, cynical sounding album about betrayal and about encroaching fascism in the culture. And then it ends with a song called "What's the Matter? What's so wrong about peace, love, and understanding?"
I know that song.
And
Okay.
what's so wrong about what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? So after an album full of darkness and fear and fascism, it ends with a very cleansing, cathartic, upbeat tune, and that's good. That's showmanship. That's where you earn the accolade popular artist. That's how you do it. You don't do it by depressing people. You do it by ultimately through uplift and intelligent and deserved uplift, not just a sappy happy ending.
Well, that's where, and Griffith would not have known this at the time, because the reference I'm about to make came, I think, 80 years after, or 70. But that sort of revelation scene that closes out the movie that we were talking about, where the angels descend onto the earth and the prison walls kind of melt away. There is a scene out in a field, I think, with a cannon that's sort of been overgrown by trees. And it reminded me of the Talking Heads song, Nothing But Flowers, where they're talking about this sort of post-industrial age where the 7-Elevens and the gas stations have been overgrown with with beautiful shrubbery. Yeah, but it's just a great, you're right, it's a great note to send audiences out with, because honestly, in that hanging sequence, it was so tense that you've got 3 executioners, and I don't know if I knew that this was how they did it, or I wasn't expecting it anyway. Sort of like in the firing squads where you have a bunch of people, the rifles have blanks, but there's one bullet, so you never know, the man never knows who pulled who had the fatal shot.
Right.
You've got 3 strings to the rope and 3 different guys with straight razors hovering over these strings, waiting for the order. Now, the order was imminent. There was one of those guys whose hand, I swear, was quivering over the rope, and I was just waiting for him to get nervous and cut it on accident.
That sounds right.
But that's probably just an effect of watching too many modern films. So yeah, do you have any closing words on Intolerance or Birth of a Nation? I think we've given people enough to hopefully be running out to go watch them right now.
Well, they're both worth seeing. I think all Griffith films are worth seeing, and the excitement, the adventure of studying film is that there's always more to see. There's always more to learn. I've watched Griffith movies since school days, and in fact, when I went to graduate school at Columbia, I was troubled that among all the film courses there was no course on silent movies. And so I and some of my classmates, we petitioned that we wanted a course on silent movies, and particularly we wanted a course on D.W. Griffith. And we got that because we demanded it. So we got it. And so we didn't see every Griffith film. And my point is, just last year, I saw a Griffith film that I had not seen before. It's called The Avenging Conscience. And it turns out to be Griffith's version of Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart.
Oh,
and it is full of imagination worthy of the man who did Intolerance. And it was new to me. I simply had not seen it until 2020. And I was not disappointed in it. And in fact, I was newly impressed with Griffith's imagination and his artistry and his cinematic innovations that still have not been topped, in my considered opinion.
where can we find that movie? Is that out, or is it coming out?
Kino has a Griffith box set, and The Avenging Conscience is part of that box set. Here in New York, a lot of times I've been able to get movies from the public library. I don't know how many cities offer that, but in New York you can. And so I would suggest that people try that if they can't find it anywhere else.
Oh, I'm gonna be on the lookout.
Right.
Yeah, well, thank you for keying me into that. That sounds incredible. All right, well, again, thank you for talking with me. I think 2021 is going to be a year for us having some really cool movie conversations with Spielberg as a springboard, certainly.
Great.
But yeah, I'm so glad that you recommended that I watch these movies and that we talk about them, because I feel really enriched. So with that, thank you very much.
I am pleased with that. Thank you.
Excellent. Everybody go out, read Armond at National Review online. Also pick up Make Spielberg Great Again at your digital retailer, I guess, because I don't even know if bookstores are around anymore.
Yeah.
No offense to those who might work in a brick and mortar one, and congratulations. And yeah, take it easy. We'll talk again soon about something, sir.
Oh, let's do it, Ian. And thank you very much. And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. All right.
All right.
Bye. Take care.
Okay.